Okay. Well, what an honor to share the stage with these three remarkable people. I'll just briefly mention that Leanna has been a mentor to me for most of my career. I turn to her for wisdom in sticky moments like this one, for example. No one's influenced my thinking actually more than Lorna about personality disorders. If you're interested in personality disorders and you haven't read her books on diagnosis or treatment, I beseech you, you must do that. And I can say, you're too modest to say this, but she's got a book coming out in a month that I can't wait to read. And as Mary mentioned, I've worked with her on her MSAD data, which is a remarkable data set, and actually under her leadership in creating the society, and have been happy to do so. Her concerns were well stated. I share almost all of them. So I think this maybe is going to be a little less than advertised. It's more of a discussion than a debate, perhaps. And I wanted to start just by a sort of a general frame, which has to do with evidence-based practice and the role of clinical work and science. The assumption of evidence-based practice is that the two things are integrated, but sometimes in our field we hear a rationale that says, well, this is like a research thing and this is a clinical thing. From my perspective, that's an idea that has to be forgotten. No good progress in clinical practice has come from anything other than science. On the other hand, science is most useful when it has implications for clinical practice. And so I wouldn't be comfortable with any argument that says, well, we need to do this for clinical reasons, even if it's not supported by data. And I'm not suggesting that Mary or anybody else is saying that. But to me, that has to be the lens, at least that's the lens through which I see these issues. And so the question, at least of the stable abstract features of personality pathology, the question of what is their nature and structure, to me, is fairly well resolved. They're continuously distributed. They take the form of a hierarchical structure, which takes a similar form in normal personality and in psychopathology. And that, to me, is a fairly bedrock finding that we have to proceed from. I think one of the challenges is that the Robbins and Gouset kind of syndrome model has been a framework through which many people have understood psychopathology in the DSM-3, 4, and 5 era. And you could think of that as like a model of how psychopathology works, or you could think of that as a testable empirical hypothesis. And the hypothesis would be that different aspects of people and dysfunction come together in the form of these syndromes, which are categorical, and if we can reliably diagnose them, then we can figure out the specific etiology and specific treatments that will ameliorate them. And my view is that the DSM-3 era has shown that that's just not a valid way of thinking about how psychopathology and personality work. It doesn't work like that. And the alternative model, despite its many warts, and the ICD-11 proposal, represent an alternative evidence-based framework for thinking about how personality and personality disorder does actually work, and that's where its promise lies. One of Mary's concerns, the second one, has to do with whether there's new content, and I think I see that slightly different. The DSM-5 project started with the criteria of the DSM-4 as its kind of raw material, and the question was, what if we applied contemporary psychometric standards to those criteria? And what ended up happening is you get a structure that looks a lot like normal traits, which to me is super useful, because these are the dimensions that neuroscientists roughly focus on, as instantiated, say, in RDoC. These are the dimensions that a large literature of basic personality psychologists have been focusing on, and Leanna talked a lot about that. So that to me is not a reconfiguration or a new sampling of personality disorder concept. It's a valid representation of what the content is that we all kind of agree represents personality disorder. Another concern has to do with intervention and, in general, application. And I think there's our fifth concern. And I think there's two parts. One was prognosis and one was treatment, and I'll just kind of lump them together as Mary did. With respect to prognosis, the literature on the stability of personality traits is massive. There's been multiple meta-analyses on various things that impact stability, genetic and environmental factors that influence stability of personality, developmental factors that influence the stability of personality. Rebecca, for example, wrote a very influential paper a decade or so ago, sort of summarizing a large literature at that time. So I'd say if the question is prognosis, we just have a lot more to go on if we link up personality disorder diagnosis with the trait literature that already sort of exists. With respect to intervention, we have a lot of work to do in linking up diagnosis and intervention in general. And I guess I would suggest that PDs aren't getting us very far, right? Most of the DSM-4 personality disorders don't have treatments that are sort of systematically organized and targeted for those treatments. Most of the treatments that exist are targeting one disorder, borderline personality disorder, and when they're compared for that disorder, they generally tie more or less. When you adapt those treatments to other kinds of psychopathology, they work about as well for those other kinds of psychopathology as they do for borderline. So I don't see that we would lose a whole lot by abandoning the categorical model and transitioning the very hard work that people have been doing developing treatments. And I don't want to diminish the treatments because I use them and we all use them. And they work, but I don't think you need to have categorical model personality disorders to see how or why they work. In fact, there's a number of books and papers that have translated the dimensions that are focused upon in those treatments to evidence-based dimensions of personality and psychopathology. And to me, that would be the way to move forward to transform treatment. Mary also expressed some general concerns about clinical utility. This has been studied. There's been a number of studies asking students, researchers, and clinicians what they think about various models of personality disorder. And generally speaking, the categorical model loses those fights. And so when you asked, for example, Les Maury asked people to diagnose a patient using different kinds of models, and at the end of that study he said, well, which one do you think was easiest to use? Which one communicates the most information? Which one leads to better treatment formulation ideas? And the preferences were slight, but certainly there's no evidence that the categorical model of PDs won on any of those dimensions. I think that's because a dimensional model is fairly intuitive and parsimonious. Now, I agree with everything Mary said about the alternative model being too complicated. I think that's an issue that we have to figure out. If you like simple and parsimonious, the ICD-11 proposal might be more in your wheelhouse. So there are details to work out, but I think that the model is fairly intuitive, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in just a second. And it's also connected to the dimensions that scientists in other neighboring areas use, which again is fortuitous. So this is a kind of picture that represents the Robinson-Guzet kind of way of thinking about things, which says, well, there's 10 different kinds of personality, and most people don't even have a personality because they wouldn't get a personality diagnosis, but if you do, it comes in one of these 10 types, and each one of these types has a specific etiology and a specific treatment, and as I say, that's just not true. It just isn't true. And so at some point, we're going to have to figure out a way to move away from this way of thinking about it into a more true representation of how personality and psychopathology works. And that's the context within which I see the various efforts in DSM or ICD or other places to make this kind of transition. I think there's promise, despite the warts that Mary focused upon in the alternative model, there's promise in these kinds of models. This is a rough summary of the way I see how they kind of all go together. At the top, you've got a general severity factor, what Leanna described as dysfunction, what some models, psychodynamic models, might think of as personality organization, what the alternative model calls criterion A, what the ICD calls severity. It's the stuff that people present with, and this, I think, addresses Mary's concern about functioning. Where is the stuff that the patient actually comes into the clinic with? That's where it lives in the alternative model. It's like the problems people are actually having in their lives. This also, Aidan Wright, by the way, in a paper in the CLIP study, showed this is the part that changes. When you model the 10 personality disorders of the DSM-4 using this kind of CIS scheme where you've got one general severity factor and 5 traits, it's the severity factor that goes down precipitously over time. And the traits basically stay the same. Not exactly, but more or less stay the same. That's a really clinically useful way of thinking about things, to my mind, right? It's not that you're trying to change the fundamental person. You're not trying to change a person's personality fundamentally. If a person's extroverted, it's fine. The problem is when that trait channeled into their life, as Leanna sort of described, causes problems, right? And so it's the symptoms, the dysfunction that you want to change, not the fundamental traits or person. Now, underneath that, I have a kind of vague box of features, behaviors, context, dynamics. I think this is the stuff that Lorna had talked about in the first talk. This is the stuff that actually clinically we need to understand. When and where does the problem manifest? How does it relate via copy processes to attachment figures, et cetera? This stuff is not it's not in the DSM-4 personality disorder model. It's not really in the alternative model of the ICD, but this is what we care about. I think the point I'd like to make, and this was resonant in both of the first two talks, is having a structure that's valid facilitates an organized approach to understanding what those contexts and features are. So the SASB serves that purpose, for example, in Lorna's work, in a way that's really elegant. I don't think it's too complicated, by the way, but some people do. Yeah. But the point is, you need to have a fairly parsimonious way of thinking about the big picture so that you can then have a framework within which to fit all of the really clinically useful dynamics that we end up caring about and intervening on. It's interesting to think, and I don't have time to talk in detail about how this might connect up to intervention. Intervention's organized perhaps the same way. There's a really big box of common factors, and then there's some sort of broad categories of differences, and then there's all the specifics. And one of the advantages of reconfiguring the way we think about psychopathology along the lines of the alternative model is that it may open up new opportunities to think about how a whole person approach to thinking about personality can dovetail with an evidence-based approach to thinking about intervention. Mary's fourth concern, was that the transition might destabilize research, and I guess that's where I kind of want to close. It's true that it's uncomfortable, and that some of the old paradigms will need to change. Some of the old measures will have to be revised or abandoned. And I guess I would just say that's the nature of science. This is how it works. When we do science, our goal, unlike any other epistemology, our goal is to be wrong. Whenever you calculate a p-value, you're testing how wrong you are. You're not testing how right you are, and that's for a reason. That's what we do as scientists. We can never be right. We can only be less and less wrong. And so I guess it just comes, my view is it just sort of comes with the territory. The rub is, can we make certain that the clinical implications of the transition are minimized to the extent that those implications are negative and maximized to the extent that they're positive? And so I see that part as more of a practical and political issue and an educational issue, as Leanna sort of framed it, than I see as a scientific or clinical issue. I think it can happen, but it's going to take a lot of work. My own view is that this is a great venue for people with some different ideas about how that should happen to come together and discuss those ideas so that we can work together to advance that cause. So with that, I thank NASPD for organizing this, Mary for discussing, and all of you for listening. I don't know if we have time for questions or time for a break.
No.
Time for time for a talk. Sorry.
But certainly at the break you can continue.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.